Water. In this country, we take it for granted. Turn a tap and it's there. It's good when we want a drink or a shower, less so when it floods us out or rains on our parade. That essentially colourless, odourless combination of one oxygen and two hydrogen atoms is essential for all life, and no camp or settlement of our ancient ancestors would have been set far from a water source, be it river, stream or spring. So where were the water sources that allowed the development of our own settlement of Clitheroe? Set on its high limestone mound, the town is quite away from the River Ribble. Merely Brook ran closer to that first nascent town, and this may well have been used as a water supply, but there were sources even nearer, owing to the local geology. In the Carboniferous period, almost 350 million years ago, this area was under a tropical sea. In that sea, crinoids lived. Though they looked like plants, and the name comes from the Greek for lily, they were in fact animals, and as they died they were fossilised, adding their carbon to the surrounding lime-rich mud. That limestone knoll now forms the ridge upon which the castle and early town was built. Crinoid fossils can easily be seen in this area. Limestone is a porous rock. Rainfall seeps into it, and where the limestone meets less porous rock, that water escapes as a spring. It's likely that those springs became the initial water source for our ancestors. Who were the earliest of those ancestors to live here? We have evidence of people in this locality from about 3000 BC, as proven by the presence of these polished Neolithic stone axes, together with a Bronze Age pole stave found at Salt Hill of around 1500 BC. But a ridge over what was a heavily forested valley with a handy water supply would have been an attractive proposition, given that it presented a defensible position and protection from other tribes and the wild animals which roam the valley bottoms. The first written record of Clitheroe as a town comes from before the Norman conquest of 1066. We read in an old manuscript that Earl Leofric, who owned the town when it was in the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Mercia, was obliged to send a fighting man from Clitheroe to bolster the king's army in or before the year 1030, so the town does have ancient origins. That the early town undoubtedly used the aforementioned springs for their water supply seems obvious, but can we identify those springs? Not definitively. But if we look at the position of the three extant town wells, we can see they're all placed on the spring line, where the porous limestone of the town's backbone meets less porous rock. It's true that these weren't the only wells in town. Some property owners sank their own wells down to the water table rather than relying on natural springs, but St Mary's, Heald and Stock wells were the public wells that allowed the town to thrive. Clitheroe is fortunate to still have these relics that allowed the early town to prosper, and we'll now look at the history of each one. The first, at the northern end of the limestone knoll, is St Mary's Well, believed to be the oldest of the town's wells. Was it labelled St Mary's Well simply because of its closeness to the parish church of St Mary Magdalene? Or does this disguise the fact that this was a sacred well of very great antiquity? In pagan times, such places were imbued with a spiritual significance, and although any specific proof has yet to be found in this locality, charms and devotionary items associated with water sources have been discovered across the British Isles and beyond. In fact, there are many legends associated with springs and wells across the world and in all cultures, often involving malevolent spirits. In Lancashire, there are tales of Ginny Greenteeth, a female goblin who waits, as the story goes, with skinny claws and secret dart for an opportunity to clutch the unwary wanderer into the water. Now, we might not have a specific sprite connected to any of Clitheroe's wells, but we do have local water sprites such as Peg O'Neill, associated with the nearby River Ribble, who's likewise likely to drown a passerby from time to time. The first written record we have of this well is in the 16th century Court Leet rolls. A court leet was a medieval manorial court, usually held twice a year by, or on behalf of, the lord of the manor. As by that date the honour of Clitheroe was held by the Crown, we do know that Queen Elizabeth I did not attend. As we see it now, it is walled and regular, with entrances to the east and west faces. It has two unequal pools, separated by a stone gangway that has a channel cut into it. Was this to allow a natural filtration of the water from the upper pool to the lower? The lower pool has a solid square standing stone in its centre. In this photograph from 1920, we can see the long since demolished cottages that surrounded it on two sides, and also, along the right-hand wall of the well, the horse trough that fronted the road. That now lies beneath the current pavement, as revealed in remedial works in 1989. And this undated photograph appears to show that the well had a pyramidal cover on it at some point. This was an interesting part of the town, as we're told that until at least the end of the 18th century, a strong tower-built manor house stood close by, surrounded by a moat. Called the Alleys, its name has now devolved onto a beautiful Georgian house that stands close by. In the 17th century, Well Hall was built adjacent to St Mary's Well on what is now the site of the Grammar School's Sixth Form Centre, again attesting to the importance of this site. The St Mary's Well we see today, unfortunately surrounded by unthinking positioning of street furniture, looks rather abandoned, and of course it is now dry like the other two wells, something we'll discuss shortly. In its time, though, it will have been a focal point of the community in this area of the town, a place for gossip as pails were filled, but also for illegal purposes. There were bylaws in place to stop people washing laundry, from washing cows and other animals, and at a time when there was little, if any, adequate sanitation, to stop people leaving dung heaps near the wells. In the papers of the Court Leet for 1593 it is stated that "We lay a pain that no townsman shall lay any carrion in any wells, in pain of every default 3 shillings and 4 pence." This bylaw was certainly needed, as later in that same year we read, "Edmund Standen, Thomas Worswick, Edward Dugdale and Ann Danes fined 1 pence each for washing in the Over Well." The Over Well is another name for St Mary's Well. A further 7 offences were also registered at the same time, including the washing of flax, wood and leather. Offences continued, and in 1645 the court had once again to order that "no tanner, butcher, skinner, or any other tradesman within this corporation shall lay any skin of horses, calves, sheep, or any other meat, in pain of every offence 10 shillings. Yet Richard Tattersall's daughter Catherine was fined for driving his goods into Stock Well to drink and piss and dung in, also in 1645, fined 1 shilling. Although the link between contamination of a water supply and illness was not properly identified at this time, it must have been most unpleasant to drink the water given such contamination. In fact, most people at this time drank small beer, very low alcohol content, but processed enough to limit bacterial infection. Before leaving St Mary's Well, it's just worth noticing how worn the stones are from generations of people using it. The next of our wells is Stock Well. As we see it today, the Stock Well is the least impressive of the three. 3 low stone walls remain, the 4th being incorporated into a high retaining wall when Trinity Chapel was built in or around 1887. There's a single entrance and a flat flagged floor. How then can this be a well, for there's now no basin for the collection of water? It appears that the floor of the well was raised shortly after piped water came to the town in the 1880s, when legend says that there was a near drowning of 2 children in its pool, as the attendant plaque states. Tragedy did strike St Mary's Well just a few years later, as reported in the Lancashire Evening Post newspaper on the 10th of July 1887. About 5:30 last night, a boy named John Horton, aged nearly 2 years old, fell into the well at the bottom of Church Brow. There were a number of children playing about it with the unfortunate lad, and one of them made a plucky attempt to rescue him. The screams of the children attracted Mrs Robinson, living close by, and she got the boy out, but he was quite dead. We can only guess how Stockwell looked prior to being flagged over, but here is a possible configuration. Firstly, prior to the retaining wall, and after the wall was built. Other features in the structure are the grooves in the 2 stone pillars guarding the narrow entrance. Were these to accommodate a shutter or door to prevent livestock entering the well? It was adjacent to farmers' fields until the 1800s. Similar grooves can be seen at St Mary's Well. This photograph, said to be from 1900, further complicates the well's history, for the low wall opposite the entrance was also much higher at that time. More investigation is needed. Again, Stockwell originated as a spring, but its name has led to some confusion. The idea that it was named after the stocks in which petty criminals were displayed simply cannot be correct, for such equipment would have been sited in the town's marketplace, and not here on the edge of town. A more appropriate source of the name would be from the livestock that were kept close by, as it was adjacent to farmers' fields, as I said. The word livestock dates from the 16th century. However, more research shows us that the name has a much older origin, which might also enable us to push back the origins of the town itself. The root of the name, as the English Place Name Society tell us, is from the Old English stock, spelt S-T-O-C, meaning the trunk or stump of a tree. Well, this is quite exciting, as Old English was the language of the Anglo-Saxons, which predates the Norman conquest of England of 1066. It is in fact the earliest recorded form of the English language, and could put the origin of Clitheroe itself back to the 7th century or before. In the 7th century, Clitheroe was a border town in the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Mercia, the border itself between Mercia and Northumberland being the River Ribble. If we look at Lang's map of 1766, Stockwell is clearly shown as being isolated from the town. A single farmhouse stands nearby, plus there's a shaded area that may possibly indicate the site of some hovels, although this isn't clear. However, overlooking the well stands the castle on its high ridge. There was no well within the castle itself, but at some as yet undefinable date, a large cistern capable of holding 15,000 gallons was built within the confines of the bailey. That cistern now lies partly under the castle cafe. As the Stockwell appears to be the nearest water source, we can conjecture that water was carried up into the castle precincts from Stockwell to fill that cistern. Incidentally, in 1941, during World War II, the castle's cistern was filled with water from the town's water main for use by air raid protection firefighters should the town have been bombed. Fortunately, it wasn't. Heald Well, also known as the Town Well, given its nearness to the centre of the town where, from medieval times, the market was held, was the largest and most important of the 3 wells. Here's an image from around 1900 of the market being held just 130 metres up from the well, which lies on Wellgate, or the Street of the Well, another indication of its consequence. Like Stockwell, the name Heald comes from Old English and means a slope, which fits in with the local topography. It too had originally 4 walls, as shown in Lang's map of 1766, but one wall was later incorporated into the side of a cottage, now Wellgate Fisheries. It's a rectangular pool with a walkway round 3 sides and 2 entrances. On either side of what we might call the main entrance stand 2 3-stepped piers of stone that look like horse mounting blocks. Given that an inn has stood adjacent to the well for hundreds of years, a nearby block to allow travellers to easily mount their steeds would be no surprise, but 2 of them in close proximity is very unusual. Let me just introduce you to one of the characters attached to Heald Well, Jemmy Driver. Jemmy was a water seller in the first half of the 19th century. He had a large barrel mounted on a cart and pulled by a donkey. Filling the barrel from Heald Well, Jemmy travelled the town selling water at 2 tins per halfpenny. He lived at one time at the Jewel upon Dun Inn, and he was a bit of a bruiser, often getting into fights. One Mr. Clark wrote of him that, had he patronised his own tap more and John Barleycorn less, his fighting would have been less frequent, meaning that he might have been less violent if he drunk water rather than beer, and I think we've all met someone like that. Incidentally, the Jewel upon Dun, with its sign of the devil riding on a dun brown horse, was a rather disreputable inn that stood on Waddington Road towards the River Ribble until the early 1800s. Jemmy is said to have had some sort of pump or lift system to raise water from the well and fill his barrel. Is it too much to suggest that at least one of these pairs of steps could be part of that system? As with the other 2 wells, there is much we still don't know. Now, we might know a little bit about Jemmy, but what about all the other unnameable people who've passed by these wells in their long history? From the innkeeper perhaps trying to keep the path to his door clear of mud and filth, or the chap from 3 doors up the road collecting water for his household, the young lass illegally washing clothes in the well and hoping not to be caught, or the folk travelling up into Marketplace for the day's market. People simply passing the time of day or discussing the latest scandal. Mill girls on their way to or from work at the looms, the first car being driven past, or men off to the wars. The wells are the silent witnesses to our town's past. Let's now look at the expansion of Clitheroe over time. Here's the earliest known layout of the town. It was produced many years ago by a local historian to represent Clitheroe in the 14th or 15th centuries, and appears to be a reasonable guesstimate of its extent. We can see that the town is very much confined to the area of the limestone ridge. Our 3 wells are marked. In Lang's map of 1766, we see that, though the number of buildings has increased, there has been little lateral expansion. 3 thoroughfares define the town: Castlegate/Church Street, Wellgate and Lowergate. Incidentally, the use of the term gate in this context simply means a street or thoroughfare, hence Wellgate, the Street of the Well. The term is of Norse or Anglo-Saxon origin, and yet a further indication of the great age of the town of Clitheroe. The town's population is around 700 at this point. To appreciate how much the town expanded through the Industrial Revolution, we must zoom right out to show the extent of Clitheroe in 1884. In the 100 years since the Lang map, the town has quadrupled in size, and its population by a factor of 10 to 7,000 souls, mostly beavering away in cotton mills. It was this huge expansion, coupled with increasingly insanitary conditions, that led to piped water being brought into the town and to the eventual near abandonment of the 3 wells. Let's rotate this map to a more usual north-south orientation and now compare it with the 1954 map. Only modest expansion in that 70-year gap, but for interest's sake we'll complete the picture with a Google satellite image to show the expansion of the town in the last 70 years. Just imagine the wells having to cope with a town of this size. During the 1800s, the wells continued to supply their wholesome water, but the explosion of the population of Clitheroe, driven by the increasing number of mills, mainly spinning cotton, now needed a supply of water for the new suburbs of the town. With most of those mills being placed near Mealy Brook, that watercourse now took the brunt of the problem, and with sewage and pollution leaking into it, disease followed. There was a major outbreak of cholera in 1849, and a report at the time identified 74 problems relating to privies, cesspits, pigsties and drains, roughly shown as purple dots on this map. The main problem areas were Waterloo, Salford and Whalley Road, all relatively new areas of the town. Here's a few of the entries reproduced from the Council Minute Book for August and September 1849 relating to Salford and Whalley Road. It is worth mentioning that this problem wasn't just confined to Clitheroe, but affected most towns and cities throughout the country at this time. Enter one Benjamin Herschel Babbage, engineer, scientist, explorer and politician, who, after the 1849 outbreak of cholera in the town, was appointed Superintendent Inspector of Clitheroe's supply of water, drainage and sewerage under the Public Health Act of 1848. Incidentally, Babbage would subsequently be invited by the Reverend Patrick Bronte, father of the famous novelist Sisters, to inspect Haworth's conditions also. Herschel Babbage, as he was usually called, had a famous father. He was the son of Charles Babbage, considered as the father of the digital programmable computer after designing what he called his difference engine in 1822. In December 1849, Herschel Babbage set to with a will, and when he delivered his report 7 months later he stated that disease, from pollution of the water supply and mainly in relation to Mealy Brook, is never absent from Clitheroe. Measles, scarlatina or typhus fevers prevail, or these in turn disappear, leaving diarrhea and cholera to supply their places, but one or other of them is always present and generally found in the same localities. In his presentation to the town corporation he said that Clitheroe might be fair and white to the eye upon superficial examination, but to the person who penetrates below the surface it was full of filth and rottenness, and his nose would be saluted by foul and noxious smells. He gave examples of the problems, such as the 18 houses that had only 2 privies between them, whose conditions were so bad that they were inaccessible from the filth that surrounded them. He recommended the establishment of waterworks to collect rainfall from Waddington or Grindleton Fells, and he also planned the course of drains and sewers for the whole town. The cost of the required reservoir and pipe to the town would be £7,000 to £8,000, the drainage and sewers a further £8,000. 6 members of the town council then wrote to the government's General Board of Health to petition that the Public Health Act not be applied to Clitheroe, as the cost will be too big a burden on the ratepayers. However, a private limited company was quickly set up, the Clitheroe Waterworks Company, which began work on a reservoir and piping, with the first piped water arriving, for some at least, in 1855. It was seen there was money in water provision, but not in sewage. The town council did set up a committee to examine the problem of sewage, but they failed to report on its discussions, and in June 1870, 20 years after the Babbage report, the council stated that, because of unspecified difficulties, they thought it unlikely that sewage work would be carried out. Well, that instance of the town council's ineptitude didn't go unquestioned. The following year, with Clitheroe's public health continuing to be bad, a Mr. Thomas Trapp of Stanley House, Clitheroe, put together a petition and lobbied the Home Secretary to direct an inquiry. Mr. Trapp's letter is lodged in the National Archives, and from it we read that no system of sewerage yet exists, and that the naturally pure stream that runs through the district is where sewage ends up, rendering it foul and offensive. Well, this was exacerbated further by the cotton mills heating up the water for condensing purposes and then impounding it in close proximity to a number of houses. It would be the mid-1890s before the sewage and drainage piping was complete. During this time, at least two of the wells, Heald and St Mary's, continued to flow, and it was good that they did so, as in January 1889 piped water was shut off for almost 48 hours as its source was switched from one reservoir to a new, larger one. A newspaper report stated, "The effect on the town was most unique. The scene in proximity to the well in Wellgate and at the bottom of Church Brow," that was St Mary's Well, "was lively and animated, with a continuous procession to and from them with buckets." In 1939, extensive building works carried out at the adjacent grammar school caused St Mary's Well to dry up, though even after that time heavy rains sometimes caused the well to fill. Heald Well fared a little better. Though a drought in 1933 caused it to dry up for a time, water was still running in 1984. In that year, an organisation, the One World Group, campaigning for the provision of clean water in what were then described as undeveloped countries, collected buckets of water from Heald Well to carry it through the town to highlight the problems of water collection in Africa. The police warned them to wash their containers afterwards because Heald Well was polluted, though this was more from litter being thrown into it by unthinking passers-by than the water itself, which was still essentially pure. Finally, Heald Well's water was cut off too, and it's now a rare occasion to see water in the well. But some people at least recognised the importance of these ancient structures to the town. The well-respected Jack Hall, then owner of what is now Wellgate Fisheries, put up a plaque at his own expense to mark Heald Well in 1976, subsequently being replaced by one installed by Seroptimists International in 1992. The Seroptimists also placed a plaque on St Mary's Well to replace an earlier tablet from 1978 by Clitheroe Civic Society that had been removed for unknown reasons, possibly by whoever carried out repairs on and around the well in 1989. A plaque adjacent to Stockwell also went missing, leading to Clitheroe Civic Society providing a replacement in 2009. Over several decades, various members of the community and local historians have written to the local newspaper, pointing out that these assets to the town were neglected and forlorn. Nothing was done. But in October 2021, as this film was being created, and after a 2-year-long campaign by a number of concerned Clitheroenians, Ribble Valley Borough Council, after first refusing to assist, finally agreed to consider the future of these important Grade 2 listed structures. It's hoped that this initiative will finally secure a meaningful future for these sites that I believe this video confirms they so richly deserve. Time alone will now tell. There was a fourth town well that hasn't survived. In 1759, a deep well was excavated over a 3-month period in the centre of Marketplace using explosives. In 1864, the well was capped and a drinking fountain placed over it. That fountain was removed in 1893 and a large public lamp, colloquially known as the Big Lamp, was placed above it, but even that has now disappeared. Clitheroe's 3 ancient town wells allowed this town to become established and played a major part in its growth, watering its population until the expansion caused by the later stages of the Industrial Revolution meant that they no longer had the capacity to serve everyone. Even then, with Mealy Brook providing the outer areas of the spreading town, it was the need for proper sanitation that finally caused water to be piped in from nearby reservoirs. But the wells still continued in use for some times, becoming the fallback supply when the piped water failed. Even though these wells are now dry, with the water diverted from them, they represent a solid link to Clitheroe's past. As I've indicated, these usable water sources probably predate our ancient castle by many hundreds of years. They've seen the passing of countless generations, of the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century that had such a major effect on the town, and, with a better understanding of public health, led to their eventual redundancy. We've traced their histories as best we can, but little more can be done at this time until the day that full archaeological examinations can take place. What a fascinating exercise that could be. We no longer need to fetch water from the wells into our houses. We don't need to suffer contamination of our water from the washing of clothes or hides and animals, or from nearby dunghills. But St Mary's, Heald and Stockwell remain tangible links to Clitheroe's past. Long may they be preserved, and this story added to.